Einen wunderschönen Tag wünsche ich. A very warm welcome to all of you. I need to switch to English because we have guests from abroad here, from the United States. So also welcome to you in front of your computer. Nice to have you here in our round. And also welcome all our guests that came physically here. Right now we are in the center of Graz in the Annenstraße. And here is our office from the Pink Panthers. In German we say the RosaLila PanterInnen. That is like the weapon of Styria, the district we live in, is the white panther on a green ground. And actually what we did, as we are the lesbian, gay, bisexual association here in our district of Austria, we changed this white panther to the pink panther. And this is where our name comes from. I am the head of this association, and what we are doing here. On the one hand, we are an institution for giving advices, for helping other people. On the other hand, we are here to change political systems. Law is not something that is done once and need to stay forever. Law is something that can change, and this is what we are doing. In the last 30 years, especially in Austria, many things changed. I can tell you some details about it, but all in all, 30 years ago, we still had to do with justice. And now, Austria is one of the #1 countries for same-sex couples regarding family law, regarding adoption, and Austrians never act like this. Once an American working colleague of mine said, if an Austrian stops complaining, there must be something wrong, take care. And yeah, so we are here now, and Austria is really a nice country, and I also appreciate that topics like designing sex today can take place here. And I'm really looking forward to your words later. But first, I want to start to explain what we are doing here. I prepared a small presentation. Let me start it. Welcome and feel free. Feel free actually is the name how we call our office in here. Yes. Actually, this year, not only 30 years of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender and intersex movement did a lot of important things. Also, our association, the Pink Panthers, we celebrate our 30th birthday this year. We were founded in 1991. Yeah, as I mentioned already, we advise people, we help people, and all this for free. Also, all our staff that is working here is mostly working for free. And this is also a very special quality of work, because the people that are active in here are not here because they need to, because they get paid for it. So we get additional guests. Welcome to our presentation. Feel free, come in. In this corner you'll find some refreshments. People that are working here are not only here because they have to or they get paid for it. No, they are here because they really want it. Because their heart is like, I want to change something. And often, of course, it's something that belongs to the people. People say, okay, I am a gay person, I am a transgender person, and I want to change. And this energy is something very special. As this energy comes from the person itself, the work that comes out of that is a very intensive, a very high quality one. And yeah, and the next slide, I want to talk about the future, because also the topic we want to discuss, or we will hear more about, is a future idea of living together, of having relationships, and of having sex. And having sex is something neutral, everyone is doing. But, and this is the point where I can talk about, where sex things are legal and where they are illegal. And this is where we are working at. Our aims are just quite simple and easy. Our main aim is that we are not needed anymore. Okay, what does that mean if we discuss about this in detail? Let's look backwards. In Switzerland, until the 70s, for women it was not possible to elect. Nowadays in Europe, no one can imagine this situation anymore. But this is not so long ago, in the 70s. Now, men and women have the same right for political elections. But if we talk about money, if we talk about career, there's still a big difference between man and woman. And when I compare this situation to the gay movement, actually we see that now in countries like here in Austria, we did already a lot of equality. We have same-sex marriage, we have adoption and many, many other things. Austria is also one of the first countries where we have more than 2 genders. In the Austrian passport you can enter man, woman, diverse, inter, nothing or an X. And open, I think, is also possible. And so many, many things are already possible. But this is the law level. Now the next level is the idea of the society, how the society thinks about all these things about equality. And again, I want to compare this to the women movement. If I compare this to the gay and lesbian movement, we see the first way is the same right. But after the same right, we need to talk about society and respect and equality in society. And this is what comes to us in the next years. Here I have a small chart what our main projects are into. So on the one hand, we need to spread information. Spread information is on the one hand advising. We have a peer advising system. That means people that are, let's say, a young lesbian girl comes and we find and ask for help, and we bring another young lesbian girl for helping on the same level of communication, on the same level of life situation, and just talk can already help a lot. And this is the so-called peer advices. We also give professional advices. We have a psychologist here. Due to political situations, it takes us a little longer to reactivate this now after the lockdown, but in September we will have again professional advices from a psychologist. Big topics are coming out, transgender, for all them for young people. Also parents come to our place asking for help. Many questions come regarding rights and law. Teachers, migrations, as well as health support is important here in the left corner of information. Before I mentioned the society, we also want to change the society, and therefore we need to be in the media. We need to be seen and we need to be present. And that's why we also have big events. We have a big ball event, a prom, the Tuntenball, which is more like a party, and we have the Graz Pride. Actually this year Graz Pride was a really big one. We never had so many guests, between 5,000 and 6,000 we think. And all these projects are important, not only to get money for our projects, they are also important to get seen. Yes. And then we also have plenty of project teams. They meet each other in here where we sit right now. It's the youth group. It's a transgender information group. We have lesbian like lesbian sports groups, and many projects. We have teachers, they meet each other. We have a group, homosexuality and religion, and many things. And people are often asking me, what happened these last 30 years? Other groups in our society weren't able to change so many things, from illegal to nearly equality. And what was the difference between the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender and inter movement to other groups in society that have problems? And I was thinking about it. This was a really tough question for me. And me, from my side, I came to one simple answer. And the simple answer is, as we say homosexuality and transgender and intersexuality is something normal. And if this is true, we come to the next point. And the next point is, these homosexual people, these bisexual people transgender and intersex people, they are everywhere in our society. They live in cities, they live in countryside. They come from every social level in our society, and this is the simple reason why this equality movement for queer people in the last 30 years went by so fast. Okay, now my question is, what's the time now? How long do I still have time? I need to check my mobile phone. Okay, because if you want, we can now continue with the official part from the Graz Museum, or I have a small quiz for you where all of you can participate. So you were laughing a little, so I cannot stop now. Let's do it a little quick. Okay, so the first questions are kind of easy. So in Austria, we just talk about Austria. Who in Austria is allowed to marry? What do you think? Everyone, gays only, straights only, or no one? Everyone, you're right. In Austria, everyone is allowed to marry. And the so-called eingetragene Partnerschaft, who is allowed to enter this registered partnership? Everyone? Yes, you're right. When the marriage was opened in Austria, it was not clear, will they open only for same-sex couples or will they also open for straight couples? They opened both, but if they wouldn't, we already had a straight couple and we already prepared to blame them because why are straight people not allowed to do this registered partnership? Okay, now it's a little more tricky. Who is in Austria allowed to legally get kicked out from a cab, a restaurant or a club? Before you know all the answers, how about you now? Everyone is get out? No one? This would be nice if no one would be allowed. So only gay people are allowed to get kicked out from it. Okay, I will explain later. But first, next question. Who is allowed to get fired from a job because of the sexual orientation? Correct. No. So get fired from a job because this was wrong. Yeah. So the cross here is wrong. No one is allowed. Sorry for that. Okay, I will explain. In Austria, we have something like a law that is the so-called anti-discrimination safety shield. Sort of. This was my translation. Yeah. So in Austria, it's not allowed to discriminate because of gender, because of skin color, because of religion. But there is one point regarding sexual orientation. In the Arbeitsrecht, in the law regarding working regulations, there the sexual orientation is included. That means the boss cannot say you get fired because you are white or you get fired because you are straight. This is not allowed. But in private law, this is possible because in private law, this key fact, sexual orientation, is not part of it. So I can say, I have an apartment, I own an apartment, I want to rent it, and I can say, I don't want to give the apartment to you because you are a straight couple. But you can say, but you can't say you don't get it because you are white. So this is the so-called leveling up, and this is one step forward we need to do in Austria. Who can adopt a child as a single person? Pardon? No one? No, this is legal. Everyone can adopt a child as a single person. Pardon?
Not really everybody. It depends on the age as well.
It depends. I didn't know that. Okay.
Please repeat.
Okay, I repeat the answer. It depends on the age, this guest here said. I didn't know that. Thank you for this information. Okay, next question. Who can become a care family, a so-called Pflegefamilie? Everyone? Some other ideas?
Depends on the age as well.
Maybe it depends on the age again, I don't know. Okay, yeah, everyone. Actually, this was possible already before the adoption got legalized. And regarding the adoption, it's also a funny story how this become legal in Austria. There was like a girls' couple, and they had the stories are different. Sorry. I think adoption. Okay. Okay. Sorry. Okay. Next question is: who can adopt a child? Everyone? Yes. Thank you. And the story I want to tell is there was a kid, and the parents weren't able to care about it anymore, and the government decided this child needs to get free for adoption, and there was an auntie. This auntie said, "Okay, I can care about the kid." But it was not possible that this auntie cares about the kid because this auntie was in a registered partnership with another girl. So this auntie was outed in front of the government, and that was the reason why adoption became legal in Austria. Interesting story. So what's the next line? Who is allowed to do medical assisted reproduction? As a single person, actually, and the next question is as a couple. So who thinks this is possible as a single person? Actually, as a single person, it's not allowed for no one. Only as a couple, in Austria, it's allowed to do the so-called medizinisch unterstützte Fortpflanzung. So the couple must be married or in a registered partnership. Okay, and last question. Who is allowed to become a surrogate mother, a Leihmutter? Any idea? Everyone. So we do this quiz also when we go to schools in our school workshops, and most of the kids in school say everyone. Actually, the answer is no one. The answer is no one. This is not allowed in Austria. And in schools, the kids wonder themselves. Because they know this from US series. And then we ask the children, what do you think? What is the price for children? Then they discuss 5,000 euros, 100,000 euros. And then we say, this is the answer now. A human being has no price. And this is, and that's the reason why a surrogate mother is in Austria or in Europe not allowed. In some other countries there are really sad stories and documentation you can check about. Yeah. Yeah. And then thank you for your attention. Now you got a little view what we're doing the whole day in here. Thank you for everything. And now I give up the microphone that is just clicked on my...
I think everyone can see... Thank you for this lively presentation. Everyone can see how valuable your work here.
Recording in progress.
Sorry.
Okay. I think how valuable your work here is. Let me welcome you on behalf of the Graz Museum. My name is Sibylle Dinesch. I'm the Vice Director. I would like also to welcome our moderator and curator, Peter Rantaša, and our guest from the United States, Jordan Pascoe. I just will give a little introduction in what we are doing and why we are here tonight, and then I will hand over to Peter Rantaša. Graz Museum, before I start into the topic, I wanted to mention that Graz Museum had a cooperation with the RosaLila PanterInnen in 2019. This was the anniversary of the really important Tuntenball 30 years anniversary, and we together celebrated this anniversary with an exhibition called Differently in a Perfect Normal Manner. And we at the Graz Museum will still have fond memories of this really important exhibition and cooperation. Thank you again for it. The project we are introducing today is the city as a data field. It's a part and partly funded by the Extended Cultural Year 2020, organized by the city of Graz. The city as a data field is a project which consists of 3 parts: the exhibition in the Graz Museum, the festival website, and the Diskursfestivals, which you are part of today. All three formats are interrelated by the work of the philosopher Willem Flusser and his book From Subject to Project, Becoming Human. Flusser pleads for moving forward and venturing utopia as a playful testing of alternative possibilities of decent life. We ourselves can decide in which attitude we want to face the future. Will we be passive and submissive or actively designing? In the festival, we have looked into so far, I'll just give you a brief overview, into the societal role of data with Peter Weibel and Len Hirschman-Lee. We've talked with the curators of the Austrian Biennale Pavilion, Peter Mörtenbeck and Helge Mooshammer, about designing cities, with Dirk Helbing about designing technologies, and in fact we were talking about civil society movements and their power in designing future, and I think this relates also very well to your topic and to your engagement. And yesterday we discussed with Ivica Prinic about designing houses. Tonight we will talk about designing sex, whom and who we will get close to in future and what role technology will play in it. Before I hand over to our moderator Peter Rantaša, I would like to mention that there will be a talk tomorrow also in the Graz Museum with Emanuel Golob on designing bodies. And the festival will also continue next week and will end on Wednesday in Graz Museum Schlossberg with discussions and drinks. So you're very welcome to come. Please stay in touch and check our website. So, but now it's Peter's turn to take over. Peter is actually right now located in Croatia. So it's really interesting times that we can all be together in a room without being together in a room. We already had a discussion about it yesterday, about this distance phenomenon. Peter, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sibylle. Thank you, Joe. Welcome, everyone in Graz. Welcome, Jordan in New York. I think my name is Peter Rantaša. I'm trained in sound art, philosophy, and cognitive science, and I'm happy to have the chance to create this interesting exhibition and the opportunity to focus a whole discourse festival on the topic of visions for the future. So what we're talking here today is not criticizing our presence, which is always a good idea, but really to develop and think how we want to live in the future. Willem Flusser, the philosopher that we have chosen for this idea, had a very nice word, actually, what should be our goal in this, saying that it is about the relationships between humans that we can design now with our technologies in a way that they manifest actually what is really human in them, the first time in history. So that's his techno-utopian stance. We all are familiar with this situation of telepresence meetings after 2 years of COVID pandemic, Zoom, I don't know, pandemic. It's the first time to moderate external. I hope this works. Otherwise, I ask for assistance from the spot if I don't see what's going on. Before I introduce Jordan Pascoe, some brief words about Flusser's take on sex, and in our exhibition, that you get an idea of the framework. Flusser, who is always a man of plays of words and puns, sees actually the sexual organs as sensory organs. His whole philosophy is built on information flow and communication. And of course, sexual organs are very sensuous organs, huge information flow, and definitely for communication. But he sees in the word sexus a dividing aspect. Sexus means division, a split, Spaltung, he writes in German. And then he takes the word coitus, is getting together. And the word intimacy, intimare, means bringing in something somewhere. So that's his framing of the topic of designing sex. And what he says, and we have a quote in our exhibition, the sex to be designed has to serve love. And he immediately says, to use the word love in these days is very difficult because it got so gluey, sticky with all kinds of ideas on it that it's basically not to use anymore. But he says, and that's interesting, that the coitus that nature developed to overcome the division of the sexus in the coitus is somehow going one step beyond just bringing together two parts, because actually it undoes the division. It goes beyond this division. And that's where he talks about real sex and makes a distinction to pornography, which does not go over this kind of just connection. I just say this because when we talk about today's smart sex toys, technologies, telepresent sex that actually are of concern, and we have on our website some descriptions of these kind of things that are related to our topic in the data field, because they eat a lot of data of the users to just be functional. So what a user of a smart sex toy actually displays about him or herself is unbearable, actually. Nevertheless, this is taking place, and many other technological means to create real or surrogate intimacy over the distance are on the market and in the making. That's the context in which we talk about new ways of intimacy, sexuality, and designing it for the future. So after this brief introduction, I want to introduce our keynote speaker. So that was from the exhibition side. But now we go beyond the exhibition, because we are discussing now how we want to live in the future, not how the industry is shaping us or proposes toys for our pleasure or not. So I'm welcoming Jordan Pascoe, professor from Manhattan College. She teaches philosophy, critical race and ethnicity studies, women and gender programs. And she's concerned with epistemology, which fits very nicely to this information take we just heard about sex, and which would not immediately bring together, and with social political philosophy and feminist philosophy. I stop here, actually. I just mentioned that she's also the director of the Society for the Philosophy of Sex and Love. So those of you who are interested in this topic on a philosophical level, there is a society, there are publications, and there is an ongoing discourse represented in conferences and so on. But now the floor is yours. Jordan, welcome.
Thank you so much, all of you, for having me. I want to thank the Graz Museum for inviting me, and Peter in particular for speaking with me at length about this incredibly thought-provoking and compelling exhibit. It is very strange to think in conversation with an exhibit that I have not seen and that I cannot come and see, that is largely in a language I don't speak very well. So I want to acknowledge the various layers of alienation here as we think together about the future across an ocean, across a language barrier, across another pandemic lockdown. So I come to this work. I'm writing two books at the moment. One is about the epistemology of sex. One is about the epistemology of the pandemic. And I have been largely thinking about these separately. And Peter encouraged me to think about them together. So that is my proposal here. So I want to begin by acknowledging the many ways that we are already in pandemic 2021 in the domain of future sex, where we are all cyborgs, where big data knows more about our sexual proclivities than we do in many cases, where virtual sex is now a global norm, where other people have often become, through lockdown, through screens, more or less hypothetical. We are living in a science fiction world of sex in more ways than one. So I want to ask in this moment, what is the work of visioning a different future for sex? What does it mean in this context to think of designing sex and to encounter sex, as Flusa put it, as a project? I ask this question in light of Flusa's framing of the self as a project, a frame that I think offers us a pathway out of long-standing debates about sexual objectification and the problem of pornography. I want to think in this moment about sex as a project in a way that disrupts some of the frameworks that I inherited as a feminist, as a philosopher, and as a woman who came to adulthood in the 21st century. So my thesis is that there are tools in the pandemic for redesigning sex. And they are the tools that we needed as Me Too unfolded, yielding new sexual knowledges and critiques without a coherent future vision. And this vision, I think, was lacking because what Me Too failed to interrogate was the logics of consent culture, the consent culture in which it was rooted. So I want to start by explaining what I mean by consent culture, which has been, I think, the dominant sexual frame since the 1980s in the wake of so-called second wave feminism. Consent culture encourages binary thinking, from the all-important, do you want to have sex? Yes or no, to the disciplinarity of gender and heteronormativity. It constructs sex as an interaction, or you could say as an interface, sometimes literally in the case of the consent apps that have come to be common on college campuses, which assumes sex as an alternative to rape, which allows us to pose the question, are we having sex yet? Which maps sex as a binary. Sex either is or is not happening. It either is or is not consensual. It is either yes or no. In consent culture, you are either the one giving consent or the one asking for it. And these norms discipline gender, ensuring that whatever is happening in other domains or fractals, in bed, you are pursuing or consenting to sex, and your place in that dynamic operates as a reminder and a reinforcement of your otherness. Consent organizes what sex is, whether it is sex or it is violence. It organizes the speech that registers, whether it is yes or it is no, the knowledge that is produced, whether or not it is consensual, the knowers involved, the participants in the sexual encounter, the sex that is had between persons with an assumed end, namely the linear male orgasm-oriented account of sex, so that withdrawal of consent produces a disruption of this male orgasm. It produces the pleasure that matters, men's sexual pleasure as a kind of given, and women's as optional, as problematic, or as performatively compulsory, with queer and non-binary sexual identities and practices often being required to map themselves along or against these axes. So I want to ask, what if, to quote Flusa, the image of humanity generated by this consent culture has become unsuitable to us? And so here is Flusa posing this question. We are those who are individuals who come together in the city. The old image of the city rests upon this image of humanity. This image of humanity has become unsuitable. Everything is divisible and there can be no individual. The human being can no longer be seen as an individual, but rather as the opposite, as the dense scattering of parts. He is calculable. The notorious self shows itself not as a kernel, but as a shell. It holds the scattered parts together, contains them. It is a mask. From this, it follows that the city can no longer be a place in which individuals come together, but on the contrary, is a groove in fields where masks are distributed. The self does not come to the city in order to come together with others, but on the contrary, just the opposite. It is first in the city that the self arises as the other of others. So that is Flusa in his essay about the city. And this says something about how I think we conceptualize sex in consent culture, as divisible entities, as scatterings of parts, calculable and disposable. Sex is, in some senses, this city that Flusa describes, where the self arises as the other of the others. This captures the disciplinary function of sex, the way that it is the domain not in which we come together, but in which our possibilities are shown to us as limited by the necessity of this otherness. This disciplinary function, I think, is revealed if we replace Flusser's city with this practiced and suitable conception of sex, which is derived from consent culture. So in this next quote from Flusser, I'm going to replace his city with sex. We'll see what happens. So the model of the city or of sex as a place where masks are lent out allows for an image of the history of the city or the history of sex to be made. The first sex presented only a few masks at one's disposal, such as that of the magician, the warrior, or we could add the virgin, the whore, the conqueror, and the homosexual, and all had to dance behind these masks. The later sex presented a multitude of masks at one's disposal and allowed one to be drawn into another during the dance. That is political, or we might say sexual, progress. In any case, what was hidden behind the old masks is the same as that behind the new, namely a swarm of disposable parts. So I want to argue that these old masks that Flusser describes are the old masks of patriarchy, which were discarded by the feminism of my mother's generation. And in the wake of that, consent culture has offered us new masks, new shells, new configurations for these disposable parts. We had feminist men. We had men who respected women. We had bottoms, tops, stone butches, bears, women on top, girl power, polyamory, pansexuality, sapiosexuality, the rise of raunch, the mainstreaming of gonzo porn, the insistence that exposing oneself, that masturbating into a plant, that a blowjob were not sex actually, and therefore not subject to the scrutiny of consent culture. While other parts of our sexual selves, our preferred porn, our arousal patterns, our orgasms, were reduced to data that did not wholly belong to us anymore, any more than our pleasure was our own, rather than a required performance of our liberation. Part of this problem, the diagnosis of our sexual selves as merely a swarm of disposable parts, is an old one that was explicitly laid out by, for example, by Immanuel Kant in the 18th century, for whom the clarity of this problem with our sexual selves made visible broader patterns of exploitation in our intimate and embodied relationships. And Kant made already a variation on the critique that I offer here. If the problem with sex is that it reduces us to this swarm of disposable parts offered up to ourselves and to others, then consent cannot solve this problem. Granting you access to my parts does not transform a relationship organized through the logics of disposability. And so we see here the futility of critiques that remain oriented through consent. If our visions of sexual justice or of future sex remain oriented through the assumptions and the interface of consent, then we have not created the space to rethink what sex can be. We are still assuming that what sex is not rape. We are defending ourselves rather than designing possibilities. Now, this is not to say that I am for non-consensual sex. I am arguing against the interface of consent. But I also do not think this is a problem that can be solved by the shift to radical intersubjectivity currently in vogue, which treats us as wholly constituting one another's sexual selves in ways that Flusser's account of the city prefigures in his claim that the city, or in my account, sex, is the place where possibilities are attracted through radical intersubjectivity. So here is Flusser one more time. New urbanism, or intersubjectivity, is the attempt at a sex plan in which the masks surface dialogically out of the relations among human beings in order to be absorbed again. The new sex would be a place in which we as an I and a you should identify reciprocally, in which identity and difference would give rise to one another. Such a city, such a sex, would require an optimal scattering of relationships among humans. Neighbor and next door should arise from others. Now, this aligns, I think, in some ways with conceptions of intersubjectivity developed in contemporary feminist theory, which have increasingly conceptualized sex as wholly intersubjective, so that, to quote Anne Cahill, the relation is first and constitutes the beings of the parties involved in it, so that existence itself is intersubjective. I want to disrupt this by pointing to the ways that the pandemic disrupted our practices of intersubjectivity and disrupted our sense of consent as sufficient for navigating relationships. And in doing so, the pandemic has led many of us to remove the masks of our sexual selves and to confront, in a long year of solitude or inescapable interdependence, the difficulty of being touched too much or touched not at all. So I want to reflect on the ways in which pandemic life challenged and expanded our practices of intersubjectivity in ways that I think have implications for the future of sex. First, there's the way that the pandemic upended our practices of relating to one another, not just the lockdowns, in terms of engagement. To see one another, we had to engage in deep negotiation. It was insufficient to ask for consent, to say, can I come inside? Can I take my mask off? Can I hug you? Or to offer an invitation, to say, can you come for dinner? Can you come for Christmas? Instead, we found ourselves engaged in deep practices of negotiation. How will we see each other? In what space and context, and with what rules of engagement? If you see me, who else will you see? And how? How careful are you being, and what is careful to you? How accountable am I to you when I am away from you? What am I willing to give up for this relationship? How will I live with myself if I get it wrong, if my choices have implications, not just for you, but for your family, for your network, for your people? These questions reveal this not as a project of consent, but as one of negotiation, the work of creating intersubjective ends. These intersubjective ends are not arrived at intersubjectively, however, but through a process of end setting, sharing, negotiating, and remapping. I'm using, you'll note, some Kantian language here. This is on purpose. I take this to be a core feature of Kant's critique of both consent and of the problem of sexual disposability. His answer to this is particularly relevant, I think, to our pandemic context. We can only have sex, he argues, if we agree to enter into a condition in which we share one another's ends. Now, Kant assumed this could only happen in marriage, but I think his argument is actually richer if it is not. So I think Kant understands sex as a project of end setting and sharing and negotiating, and ultimately a future deliberation within a community of ends. And this captures, I think, much of what human interaction has been like in the pandemic, an ongoing practice of setting carefully considered ends and limits for ourselves in turbulent conditions, choosing our projects and our priorities, choosing our community, and then sharing our projects and priorities within that community, negotiating them with those with whom we want or need to engage, and arriving at, or in many cases failing to arrive at, communities of ends, conditions in which we are deeply accountable to one another, in which our epistemic practices are reoriented through these carefully constructing relationships, which are often a plurality of relationships. So I want to say just a few things about this approach. First, it captures not just the intersubjective dimension of our sexual lives, but also our negotiations with ourselves as we filter and construct our sexual desires, choose those we will act on in the world, choose and set ends for ourselves, and begin to decide which of those ends belong to us alone and which will need to be shared and negotiated with others. It treats our sexual selves, in other words, as a project. This names the work many of us had to do in the pandemic when our normal sexual engagements were suspended, and we had to choose new kinds of sexual ends, limits, priorities, and projects, making this part of the process visible to many of us for whom it had simply been assumed. It revealed fantasizing as a kind of end-setting project. It captures the ways that intersubjective engagement is a deeply vulnerable process, since part of what we do is reveal ourselves, our chosen projects and preferences to one another. Consent has trained us to avoid this by refusing to have projects in the first place, to just show up ready to say yes or no to what's on offer. It begins to name the deep practices of accountability in intersubjective relationships that we have been forced to encounter through COVID-19. Our awareness of one another's vulnerability, of how the impacts of our actions affect those with whom we are interdependent, and our sense that a failure to hold ourselves accountable is a deep, deep and unconscionable violation. But in doing so, it refuses to reduce the project of our sexual selves to only intersubjectivity, a discourse that is particularly dangerous for those of us working from standpoints that have been traditionally encouraged to find ourselves, our desires, our ends in others, who have been encouraged to think of sexual ends as somebody else's domain. It also demands a more rigorous epistemic practice of end sharing, one that we have already become practiced at in pandemic negotiations. Having sex, enacting a common fantasy, building a relationship means having what Miranda Fricker has called a gentle epistemic follow-through. Fricker identifies 3 distinct epistemic features of this kind of transformative knowledge. First, respecting someone else's ends means having inferential follow-through. I have to ask myself, how do your ends change the way I think about my ends and about what this sexual encounter is? If your partner's sexual ends do not include intercourse, but do include orgasms of her own, then how do those ends change the way in which you think about what your encounter is? How does knowing these ends transform the ends, expectations, and entitlements that you bring into this encounter? Second, respecting and sharing someone's ends means having motivational follow-through. It means recognizing these ends as a reason to act accordingly. It is not a merely passive or interesting fact that your sexual partner has certain limits or would prefer a particular position or kind of touch. Respecting those sexual ends means taking them seriously as limits on or reorientations of your own sexual ends. It means rethinking and transforming your own ends for the sake of this encounter, and it means acting as if your partner's ends were your own. And finally, this means having practical follow-through. It means, in fact, acting accordingly. The sexual ends you act on in this encounter will be those that have been subject to this process of reconsideration in light of the ends of your partner. The ends you act on will be those ends consistent with those of your partners in a shared community of ends. Now, I think these are no longer a radical set of practices, but ways of being with ourselves and each other with which we have experimented in the pandemic, where every interaction has been subject to intention, reflection, diffraction, negotiation, and accountability, and where our failures and our refusals to do this work have produced vulnerability, violation, trauma, and death. So this is the work, I think, of being together in ways that serve love. This is not only the work of sex, although it is the work of creating and sharing our sexual selves. This is the work of creating selves that can not only serve love, but selves that can be accountable to love. Love for ourselves, love for each other, for the potentials we attract and become together and otherwise. And so this is my vision of designing future sex, sex as an experimentation in accountability. Thank you all so much for inviting me and for making space for this conversation. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to think with all of you.
Thank you very much, Jordan. I have to say that 3 times I lost my internet connection, so I have whole. You hear me? Okay. But I would like to follow up with one question. So can we straightforward say that in the pandemic condition and also in the future condition, negotiating means making explicit for oneself and for others actually what used to be implicit and not have been spoken about.
Yeah, Peter, I think that's right. And I think that what's particularly important about the way that you framed that is that it is this work, not just, I think we think of it as being the work of making explicit to others. And the piece of it that I really want to focus in on is the work of making it explicit to ourselves in ways that allow us to be accountable to ourselves in negotiations with others. And I think that that is the piece of it that we have been forced to become practiced at in the pandemic, right? Where I think all of us have had moments, right? Where you're in a social situation and something happens that you are not comfortable with. And the pandemic has forced us to say, I am accountable to myself and my community here, and I cannot be unmasked with you in this space, right? And those are precisely the practices that I think we need to carry over into our future sexual encounters. Yeah.
Thank you. I would like to immediately open up. I think it was very clear to the audience to react, comment, or have at first maybe questions of understanding. Let's start maybe if there have been questions of understanding, because we're talking in a language which is not ours, unfortunately. So yeah, I don't see you on the floor. I see you very tiny. So would anyone raise a question, or was everything clear and understandable so far? Okay. Good. So it seems to have been clear. So any comment about the experiences maybe from the audience in this kind of accountable negotiation of encounters in the pandemic condition? Would anyone like to share? Okay. I give an example that is a second-hand anecdote, which is a bit strange, but to make it clear what to talk about. My neighbor, that's why I say it's a second-hand, Anna is a nurse in an intensive care unit, actually in a COVID intensive care unit. And she witnessed the death of a 60-year-old man who went out with a COVID, how do you say, denier. So his friend was a COVID denier and they went out, of course, no masks, because this is what she demanded because of her lifestyle, her ideology, and so on. And he enjoyed the, and he was a sporty man and he was dead after 2 weeks. So this was a practice of implicit non-negotiation, so to say, but it shows and makes a connection, because Flusser makes also a connection about sex and death and life and so on. Yeah. And so that's why I was asking if there are any experiences, because especially relationships that have been not in the core, like family unit, that have been in the making or fluid, had difficulties to be maintained in the pandemic lockdown situation. And of course, like all other relationships in society, had to be negotiated. Break the law, break the rules. I think even politicians who broke the rules, I think in England was a case of a politician who saw his partner and was outed then of his position, so on. My question would be, for this accounting to oneself and follow through, which I find it's a brilliant point, but the question is, are our encounters as we organize them in the ritualistic ways set up for this? I run an underground music club in Vienna, and you know, the music is loud and the bar is running and so on. And is there space for what you are asking for, and does our culture provide for that? And if not, actually, where would be the moment to insert this negotiation?
Yeah. Yeah, Peter, I mean, the description of the loud music club is such a good example of this. It's the question I get all the time. You know, so many of our hookups are happening at parties, at bars, at clubs. You know, they're happening through shorthand online. You know, there's not time for this kind of negotiation, right? And I think there are two things to say about that. One is that what happens in those moments where there isn't, where we play out the roles that have been given to us, right? And in the moment where the music is so loud, and so you're just using gestures in order to get where you want to go, what we rely on are existent power dynamics in order to shape the interaction. And this was one of the things that I saw really persistently in the stories that emerged throughout Me Too, was the way in which in spaces where there were not clear articulations of what was going on, it was old power dynamics, established power dynamics that were then organizing interactions. And that's what I have found so interesting about what has happened in the pandemic, is the way in which I think those power dynamics have in many cases been upset by our shared assumption that people have a right to be accountable to themselves. And as a woman living in patriarchal culture for my whole life, that is a radical concept to me. The idea that it is up to me whether or not I wear a mask, that it is up to me whether or not I allow anybody within 6 feet of me, that it is up to me under what conditions I interact with somebody, and that regardless of the other kinds of power dynamics in play, my accountability to myself and my family is so strong that needs to come first. That is a radical way of being in the world for those of us who've been normed by the assumptions of patriarchy, of misogyny, of white supremacy, right? And so I do think it will mean making space for these kinds of negotiations. But what's interesting about this moment is we've been forced to make that space, right? And I don't know what's happening in, for example, if clubs have restarted in Vienna, but if they have, I suspect that some of these negotiations about personal space, about intimacy, are happening anyway, whether or not they're of a sexual nature. And so I think we are in this moment where these tools are possible for us if we can understand their power, right? And we can understand the way that this has reframed our relationships to ourselves, our accountability to ourselves as a central piece of the work of intersubjectivity.
Do you see a fundamental difference to the negotiation of safe sex practices with another virus that we had not so long ago?
Yeah.
Do you think that this is now fundamental different in the quality, or it's just in the quantity, new kind of negotiation needed? How would you compare this?
This is part of my critique of consent culture. I think that in the 1980s, there was a real emergence of some very, very complex negotiating practices within queer communities. And this had to do with, the ways in which what sex is not a given, right? In queer sexual exchanges, the ways in which HIV/AIDS complicated, right, these questions. So in other words, consent was not central to LGBTQ sexual practices in the 80s and early 90s. Part of what my project is aiming to look at is the way in which consent overwrote all of those practices and became kind of the dominant cultural norm for how we decide what sex is, and naming consent as a heteronormative construct that did real damage to queer communities who had already done this this work in the 70s, the 80s, the early 90s. And so yes, I think those tools are already there. I think that they were absolutely central to survival in queer communities in the 80s and 90s. I'm also very interested, for example, in how during the HIV/AIDS epidemic in South Africa in the 90s and early 2000s, similar kinds of discourses around sexual negotiation arose. So there is this very interesting linkage that we've seen time and time again between contagious epidemics and these discourses about sexual negotiation. So I don't think what I'm saying is new at all. I think it is slightly different because, again, this is a pandemic. And so it has reorganized and reoriented all of our lives, right? And so we are seeing these reorientations happen, not just in subcultures, but plausibly at the level of the culture at large. And so, you know, I am hoping that if we can be in this moment, that this perhaps provides us with a place from which to dismantle the ubiquity of consent culture.
I give one more call to the audience. Any questions that you would like to raise? Okay, if not, then I give you one more question, then I ask you for your closing words, so to say. My question would be for online contacts, for technological mediated contacts, which very often actually are not the contacts of my choice, but the proposal of an algorithm, where the masks that you referred to, Flusser was writing, might be from deep fakes to I don't know what, yeah? So what kind of negotiation practices would you envision here, and also security or safety measures against abuse that might be needed?
Yeah, I mean, this is an area where I think I need to do a lot more thinking. But Peter, you said something in your opening remarks that really struck me about this, which is about, you know, the ways in which we are giving up so much information about ourselves. We are selling ourselves off as this swarm of disposable parts in these digital spaces, you know, often in ways we don't even understand. Like I bought a toothbrush recently, and it wanted to track my toothbrushing and send it to an app. And I thought, I do not want this company to know how I brush my teeth. That's deeply intimate, right? And so the idea that a vibrator might be tracking my rhythms in a similar way, right, and uploading those to the clouds, and that would become part of the sort of data information available to me that is circulating in ways I don't understand, that is terrifying. And it opens us up to a whole range of, you know, a whole range of sort of being treated as disposable parts, right? Of being owned by others in ways we don't understand, being understood by others in ways we don't understand. And so I think, again, the piece that I would point to here is this question of accountability to oneself. And I think that this is a frame that, again, we need to bring to our digital spaces as well. And the irony here is that I think the pandemic has made that more difficult, right? I think many of us have given up much more of ourselves in the last year and a half to big data than we might have otherwise, because we have no choice. We have to use these platforms to have this conversation. And so we are willing to click that accept button over and over and over again, consenting to be tracked in various ways, right? So while I think we have become much more careful in our physical embodied interpersonal interactions in the world, I think we've become less careful in our digital interactions. And so I think that we need to do some real work thinking about these frameworks of accountability to ourselves. I think about this in terms of my children. What is my job being accountable to my children's future by protecting their data, right? You know, do I want their toothbrushing to be tracked by large companies? Because this is not their choice to make, it is my choice to make for them. And so I think that this is a place where we have been forced by circumstance in the last year and a half to fail in our accountability to ourselves is in in digital spaces. And that this needs to be a conversation that we have in a much more rigorous way as we think about what the future holds. Yeah.
Just one word on the funny toothbrush thing from a cognitive science and data science perspective. Of course, they don't track how you brush your teeth. These machines track a lot of metadata, and what they do actually is they create a digital double. And I recommend, for those of you who have not heard it, the brilliant talk by Dirk Helbing we had on Monday, which will be online on our website. He introduced this digital double. So if you talk about your vibrator, it does not only tell you your primary reactions, it talks about your health status, about your mental status, so it creates a whole double that actually projects you, that can give predictions of you, and technologies that are persuasive then frame you. So you become actually the data that you give, but not on your choice, but by this persuasive technology. That's the vision. They create a self of you that you don't even know about, but basically one that consumes whatever you are told to consume. So this first-hand data is not the interesting thing, it's the whole kind of setup. And of course, in this intimacy space where tools that bridge distance are actually mediating interactions, it's specifically of concern. Yeah.
Well,
how to.
And the thing I would say to that, Peter, is that part of why I think what I'm pointing to here is deeply relevant to that, is that the way in which that data is accessed is through consent, right? It is that moment where you get you click on the button, I consent to release this information, I consent to, or you consent to be doubled. And so I think it's really important to think about the way in which the norming of sexual consent culture has sort of made us practiced in this idea that you just say yes to what's on offer. And that is now what we do in digital spaces all of the time. And we think of consent as meaning that we are voluntarily participating. But consent simply means the right to say yes to somebody else's offer or lose access altogether to the thing in question.
Yeah,
right.
And that's actually what happens in the club when you exchange the Snapchat, whatever. Then first, it's not the company consent, but the consent of the channel that you might build up this relationship. Yes. Yeah. Okay, that's a big topic, but I would, as the audience seems to be more overwhelmed and listening, I would ask you for your final words and then give back to Sibylle Dienesch on the spot. So. Would you like to draw a conclusion, Jordan, or you have said everything already?
I think I have said everything I needed to say. I just want to say thank you to all of you for coming and for listening. And I hope that these thoughts about the limits of consent culture and the possibilities of self-accountability may be useful to you in perhaps ways that are surprising going forwards.
We are going to make this recording available through our website, and so you're all welcome to share it and comment then on the online channels and continue this conversation. Thank you, Sibylle.
Thank you, Jordan. Thank you, Peter. I think it's a kind of difficult setting for discussions, I realize, and I think it's also difficult because it's in English, but I guess here is beer and drinks, and I guess we can have a talk, a conversation, unfortunately without you both. Thank you to you, and have a good day, have a good evening, and yeah, we are continuing tomorrow for who's interested in talking about designing bodies in the Graz Museum. Herzlichen Dank fürs Kommen und schönen restlichen Abend.